So my name is Maxine Doogan, and welcome to Dominate the Nation.
I am Domina Elle in Denver, Colorado. Welcome. Thank you for joining us.
And today, on our rendition of our show today, we're going to continue our foray into bringing you some of the Prostitution Nation history. And our guests today are Devon Angus and Ivy Anderson, who wrote a book called Alice Memoirs of the Barbary Coast Prostitute. And I ran into them recently at the San Francisco Mission Neighborhood Association meeting, where the Mission District neighborhood was up in arms because of a FOISTA bad laws that, have forced a bunch of us back onto the streets because we can't advertise any longer online. And so the neighborhoods are starting to go berserk because all of a sudden, the whore nation is just out in force. And so to temper the neighborhood's exasperation, it was great to hear from Ivy and Devon that, we've been here before with the neighborhoods and with prostitutes being, shuffled around from neighborhood, from street to street, from venue to venue. And so I just felt like it was really important to hear from them, hear about the book that they wrote, about Alice, who she was, about the challenges that she was facing, and, talk about how that relates to us today. So welcome to the both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Such a pleasure to be here.
So how did you guys make it to the Mission District Neighborhood Association meeting?
Oh my gosh. Well, essentially we heard a call out through friends who are sex workers or sex worker rights activists and allies who essentially put the call out that the Central Mission Neighbors Association had adopted a zero tolerance policy for sex work in the Mission District, and that they were asking for increased police foot patrols, as well as other ways of regulating and further criminalizing sex workers. There's essentially a call out to ask allies and activists to come show support for sex workers in the neighborhood, and are our neighbors here in the Mission. I live in the Mission District in San Francisco. Devon lives not too far in Heights, and we've just seen these sort of cleanup campaigns time and time again. It felt like we could lend a critical perspective because the research that we have done focuses on similar movements that were happening in San Francisco and across the United States from 100 years ago. And frankly, much of the reason why we have this street walking corridor on Cap Street and South Van Ness here in San Francisco actually dates back to 100 years ago, around 1913, when the closure of the Barbary Coast, the closure of what was sort of a segregated vice district or an accepted red light district in San Francisco, pushed sex workers into street work. And from what I understand, that was when the Cap Street corridor first took hold here in San Francisco. So this history goes back 100 years, and it's something that has just been forgotten in public memory, and a message that we think is critical to sort of understanding how we regulate sex work today and how we can attempt to do it in a humane.
Yeah, one of the points that we wanted to make, or that became really apparent as we were going to this meeting, is that this Cap Street corridor, which first we knew about from coming from like 1990s, Cap Street was a unofficial designated vice district in San Francisco. And because we had looked at the history of the Barbary Coast and how the Barbary Coast had been completely wiped from San Francisco's memory, other than sort of this rough old tumble town of San Francisco, some sort of
Wild West fantasy making.
Yeah, this kind of idealized past, idealized underworld, in sort of this mythology of San Francisco. And Cap Street has been what it is, which is a street mission. And as the mission transforms, we are seeing just verbatim these exact same arguments that was happening 100 years ago. And these are the things that started coming up in the 1990s when there was a city task force that actually ask sex worker voices to come into the fold.
Yes. I remember that task force. That task force was the San Francisco Task Force on Prostitution from 1994 to 1996. It was commissioned by one of the sitting board of supervisors. His name was Terrence Hallinan, who later became the district attorney for the city and county of San Francisco. And how he rode into office was, kind of on the coattails of all the work that this task force had done, saying that prostitution shouldn't be criminalized, and as a district attorney, he was not going to enforce the prostitution law. So once he was sworn into office, then he became under great pressure from the mayor, Willie Brown, to enforce the law. And the mayor threatened him and told him, if you don't enforce this law, we are going to, I'm going to remove you from office. So, Cap Street, all the strolls, the people where, workers walk, the complaints from the neighborhoods are always the same. Issues of the trash. And like I told some legislators recently, yeah, you've got trash there because imagine if you as a good citizen prostitute were carrying around, the used condoms from your clients. And at the end of the night, you go to dispose of your used materials, your gloves, whatever you've used. But in the course, before you get to the trash, you're picked up or you're stopped by a cop. And they search you. And they find all this used material. It's going to be used as evidence that, you're working as a prostitute. So it's really not in our best interest to carry around this used material. So either neighborhoods can get more trash cans, they can change the laws, but it's been really neglectful, in my opinion, that the City Planning Commission continues to talk about, traffic, flows of traffic, about permitting for apartment buildings or businesses, and they completely ignore the fact that we're there, that we're on the street, that our commerce is there, we're part of the community, the economics that we bring into the community have value. If my customer drives, in to see me, they have to stop for gas at some point. The local merchants benefit from my economy. We are in mutual benefit to each other's economies. So it's just always perplexing to me how these realities have never made it into, the public discourse either 100 years ago or now. I mean, did you come across of any of those types of discussions in your history?
Well, I just wanted to note that, so going to this Central Mission Neighborhood Association was, it was so eerie because you could see that the sort of forces that were pushing back against sex workers were so similar to those from 100 years ago. I mean, once again, sex workers, so at this meeting, first of all, the Mission District has been primarily a Latinx, a Latinx neighborhood since the 1970s, and since the 1980s in particular, since Reaganomics, pushed, millions of Central Americans to migrate up here to the United States. But this particular community meeting was entirely housed by white people who were wearing all of the marks of wealth. They all had this sort of, what we in San Francisco can identify pretty quickly as a techie costume, be it khakis and a nice button-up shirt. So they're calling themselves representative of the Mission District neighborhood, but in no way have represented any of the cultural or economic diversity that exists here. And the way that they were talking about sex workers and was the same way that they were talking about, like you said, trash on the streets and homeless people. And so you see this, and we could hear this immediate dehumanization that was happening in the language, them these neighbors demanding that the public works department take out the trash, essentially, and equating these humans, these sex workers and homeless people who have been forced to live on tents on the streets, as that trash that's in need of eradication, a zero tolerance policy for the existence of these human beings, and without any clear, and you could tell that once the neighborhood sort of stood up and started confronting these people about this dehumanizing, this horrific language that they were using to talk about people, that they had never actually heard, they had never heard the phrase sex work. And so there's this real disconnect. There was no, and that is so very dehumanizing. And what was so apparent to us at that meeting is that, the motivations behind regulating sex work, from what we understand through our research of studying Alice and issues around criminalizing sex work 100 years ago, is that the prosecution of sex workers often coincides with gentrification movements, attempt, to capitalize upon real estate, to quote unquote clean up neighborhoods and make them palatable for sort of white affluent communities, as well as campaigns to control and rein in people's bodily freedoms, mostly women's, to control women's bodies is a major issue, but anyone who doesn't conform with some sort of heteronormative ideal, and then white supremacist and eugenical movements. And those were all of the factors that were interplaying in 1913 in San Francisco that pushed city legislatures, or actually the state legislature, to criminalize sex work in a much more heavy-handed way than they ever had before.
And I would just add in an interesting dynamic that was going on in that meeting that was very similar in 1913 when Alice Smith's memoir that we had published came out, which was the height of this idea of what they talked about, like white slavery, of this victimhood, that all sex workers were these soiled doves, that victims had to be saved. And what you saw, just like then, and at this meeting, and once again, this sort of idea of trafficking has become such a media hysteria within this narrative of Trump's America and borders and social purity, is that on the one hand, to kind of mask essentially treating people just like numbers, like when people are coming, the city's coming in to clean up, they're like counting people as if they're just these statistics. They're hardly names. It's for optics. It's for often homeowners to feel safe, so-called safe in these societies, and it's an aspect. And so people who are on the streets that are considered undesirable are seen as a similar thing to being like potholes that have to be filled. But then on the other hand, there's this aspect of, well, all of these people, all of these women on the streets are victims of trafficking, and thus we have to call the police and have them be saved. And this is exactly what's going on in 1913, and what we certainly found now, and what we found in 1913, was that these women were very mistrustful of the police and of these middle class groups that were trying to save them, for a very good reason, because sex workers have never been able to trust the police, nor should they, because they haven't really been given enough reason to. And this kind of disconnect, that where you could see the gears turning in their minds of them justifying cleaning up the streets because there's this victimhood, call the police, and then they're gotten rid of, and then their conscience is clean because these women have been saved, because now they're safe. And,
safe behind bars.
Yeah.
You asked if people were having debates like this, 100 years ago when we got a little off topic, but the answer to that, yes.
Yeah.
So we're kind of in the same spin cycle, is what you're saying.
Yes.
And so, what, based on your experience and your historical scholarship, do you predict is going to happen, or what should be happening?
Well, I think one thing that we found is that there was doubt as we were publishing this, as to whether Alice Smith's memoir was real, because at the time there was a lot of propaganda and a lot of false memoirs that were used as propaganda for these sort of social cleanup movements.
Oh, and that sounds familiar.
and the amount of doubt about not only Alice Smith but also what the newspaper was doing is there's this dialogue between a lot of sex workers started writing letters into the paper and talking about Alice's memoir as it was being published, and they started talking to each other through these letters. And it was actually something, if you go through the paper, they didn't publish a lot of letters to the editor. And all of a sudden, this is really this unusual thing. They decided to publish all these letters, but still, when we do talks, we have people come up and say, well, don't you think they're writing those letters themselves in the paper? And
how could these sex workers write so eloquently? Weren't they uneducated and helpless? I guess direct is, which might be useful for your listeners. So about 5 years ago, Devon and I, we were researching this newspaper, the San Francisco Bulletin, which was under the editorialship of this really remarkable and fascinating character, Fremont Older, who we think is sort of one of these forgotten heroes of San Francisco, who's been sort of written out of the history books. So we're looking at the San Francisco Bulletin newspaper, and we end up uncovering this serialized memoir of a woman who went by the moniker Alice Smith. The memoir was titled A Voice from the Underworld, and it ran 6 days a week between June 1913 and August 1913. And as installments of her story were being published, which is essentially a story about how she became a sex worker and then moving in and out of different modes of sex work, from being a dam to being what she calls herself a freelance worker, working in brothels, sometimes in partnership with a man, sometimes not. And as she's detailing her story, you had hundreds of letters. The bulletin claims that 4,000 letters were sent in, and we have at least just over 112 of those that we counted that were written by self-proclaimed sex workers. And those, and so suddenly in the pages of the newspaper, so Alice was writing her memoir in response to this law that was looming over sex workers across the state. It was called the Red Light Abatement Act. It was a law that was designed to target the property owners of buildings that were suspected of being brothels. And so the goal of this law was to essentially shut down the Barbary Coast, which had been essentially an official segregated district, a vice district. And red light abatement laws were starting to pop up all across the country in response to this white slavery craze and phenomenon, which is also one of the first times that you really see trafficking victims and sex workers being conflated as one and the same.
It's also just worth noting what this term white slavery was in itself a response to this greatest influx of immigration in American history between 1890 and 1920, roughly. And so a lot of what the hysteria that was going on was white women being kidnapped and sold into slavery, often by urban pimps of color, essentially, would be sort of like how narrated by this racial of white slavery.
So these white slavery narratives, these essentially fake prostitute memoirs, were being published in newspapers across the country. They were drumming up all of this outrage, especially within early women's movements. Women had just gotten the vote in California at that time, 1911, and were mobilizing for the vote across the country. But who was the voting base? Primarily affluent white Christian women who were horrified by these stories of their fallen sisters and felt it was their duty to, as women, bring purity into the masculine world of law and politics. And their first campaign for doing that was to try to rescue their fallen sisters without any real understanding of why sex work existed, who was engaged in it, the many different, varied reasons why people get into sex work. So for the first time in this newspaper, coinciding with the publication of Alice's story, you see these debates playing out across the pages of the paper. You see the mayor of Berkeley suddenly having to confront his own concepts of what, prostitution was and meant, while he, in response to a letter from a sex worker, there are women who were trafficking victims or who felt very much entrapped in the system of sex work, writing alongside women who were like, I made this choice out of my own free will. How can you judge me for it? And so you see this sort of panoply of voices, clergymen, feminists, creating these debates and discussions about sex work that frankly were so modern that it was striking issues that we're still contending with, in the media at large.
And also what happened to the paper from it is that there was enough pressure from these anti-vice groups that they threatened to have the U.S. postmaster label it as pornography, and the paper would have to actually be shut down. And they seemed to fight it, and actually we don't know what the ending of Alice's narrative really is, because the paper was facing closure from the publication of her memoir, and they had to end it this date of August 12th, was it? August 12th, Fremont Older, the editor, writes in and says, he has to write in, he says, don't worry, we're ending the memoir August 12th, and there'll be no more, pornography in our papers.
So this threat against the publications is exactly what the FOISTA that got passed in April was. That, the Fight Online Sex Trafficking Bill, targeted the publishers of online content of our ads. So we're doing the same thing that we've already done. And, the efforts that were done then didn't end prostitution, didn't end forced labor. The efforts today of forcing people off the street or, further policing them or passing these laws that booted us offline, they're not working either. So we wonder, what's the real end game here?
Something as I read the book that I found very fascinating, not just the fact that there are so many similarities between, what happened over 100 years ago and now, was how this journalism, these exposés about prostitution actually played a huge role in forming journalism and how journalism, was pushed forward. And I'd like to just read a part here. In the decades surrounding the publication of A Voice from the Underworld, prostitution exposés took the country's media by storm and dramatically changed the form and content of U.S. news. Beginning in the 1870s, journalists more often shirked the private interest pieces that had dominated the pages of papers, turning instead to muckraking reportage, which aimed to reveal the interconnections between greedy businessmen and corrupt politicians in the country's biggest cities. For the first time, mass distribution allowed papers to gain readerships far from their printing presses, and this provided the opportunity for far-flung activists to unite for common causes. Reform movements grew out of these exposés and vice versa. Although the economic concerns of increasing circulation and advertising revenue were always paramount on the business end, newspapers also made good use of this chance to serve as a public forum. Some of these papers during the exposés, their readership, quadrupled. I mean, they were so into, one of them was fivefold, the readers, they were just so enthralled with these stories of prostitutes. Although muckraking is most famously associated with political scandal, the form was realized first and foremost by investigations into white slavery, which, fueled by racial anxiety, conflated prostitution with sexual enslavement, organized crime, and civic corruption. So I just find it really, fascinating that, that, wow, I mean, this was such a huge component to just the bigger picture in the United States. I mean, we had the FBI, the BOI became the FBI at that time. You had journalism being hugely, what's the word I'm looking for, developed around this entire hysteria. And then, all of these groups, women's groups, and, another from the book, there was another expose called The Maiden Tribute, which was written over in London around that same time. And, it made its way, and it's kind of backwards, where we've, in the United States, in the modern, current, we've had to deal with all these anti-trafficking false narratives that are now making their way over to England at this time. It was backwards in a way before, where, it moved over here to the United States. If I'm not correct, please let me know. But the Maiden Tribute was another expose, which it appears that it was greatly false, that it was just, muckraking reporting. And it made it into the hands of Frances Willard, the president of the National Woman's Christian Temperance Union, who was so moved by the sordid tale that she immediately adopted anti-trafficking and age of consent reforms as new tenets of their organization. And by 1900, the Woman's Christian Temperance Union was the largest women's organization in the U.S., with 500,000 members nationwide. And their membership was comprised exclusively of wealthy, married, educated Protestant women, and they advocated for suffrage with the belief that women could purify American society through the ballot box. And one of the first things they did when they got the right to vote was attack prostitution. So that's the women's rights that they were, But it's really fascinating. There's a lot of fascinating things. I really highly suggest people read your book. It's been a real eye-opener for me in a variety of ways. But this whole reform movement, this wave of puritanical craziness, I mean, it just so parallels, what's going on again today. But so anyway, I just couldn't believe that as I was reading it, and all of this is really fascinating, but it's just sad too, because it's a reality. And they thought they were abolishing prostitution, and obviously it's just never going to work. Never. Never.
Well, another part of what's interesting is these narratives and these white slave narratives, and there's so many of these false memoirs that were that were part of journalism so they could sell papers, because it was it was shocking and titillating. But these other papers were shut down over it. What's really interesting is, why was the Bulletin threatened with being shut down over it? And it really seems the difference is that the Bulletin took a really open view. The Bulletin wasn't pro-sex work per se. It actually was saying, we don't know. We can't really know what the experiences are. We need to ask sex workers themselves, and they need to be part of the dialogue. And you don't really see other people doing this so much. It's also worth noting that a lot of these memoirs are false, and some people thought that Alice Smith's memoir was false, was because there were so many falsities. Alice Smith wasn't her name, and we have actually discovered who she is, and we've, through primary source documentation, have proven that her memoir can actually be followed. She didn't write it down. It was actually through interviews, so it was ghostwritten. But we find parallels, and she changed names, but the names are so similar to people's real names within it, and what she does throughout it can be followed. It's really, we feel like the paper really, when we have proof that the paper really wanted to get her story down, and to have it just be told, and to have that be part of the dialogue. And it would appear that really is the kicker. It's not like it's a so-called smutty memoir. It's not like it was really titillating. It's actually, calling it pornography is actually what it was. It was truth-telling. And it was truth-telling in a way that wasn't happening in other publications. And that's why we really felt like this is completely lost. I mean, no one's published this, and hardly anyone's ever talked about it since they did a good job of really silencing her voices. What was really important for us to bring it out was that this political act of her telling her story, and these letter writers writing in, and the fact that they haven't been believed and still aren't being believed was something.
And that's been an interesting thing for us, as historians. There's this real expectation that you have to, you back up every single statement with direct primary source proof. We didn't have that when it came to Alice's memoir, that it was a legitimate memoir, what have you, up until the publication of our story, because she did write under a pseudonym, which for a historian looking back at that time could easily be read as, well, this is obviously one of those faked memoirs that was written by a reformer that was campaigning against white slavery, because that is what the vast majority of these documents are. Or you could see it through the lens of sex workers, of course, throughout history have had to don pseudonyms in order to protect their identities, from the police and also from the judgment and shaming of greater society at large. And we just knew, we instinctually trusted Alice's story, specifically because it doesn't follow, it moves outside of many of these constraints that the white slavery narratives at that time really had. It follows some of those tropes. She was a poor white woman from the Midwest who moves to the big city and becomes a sex worker, but her story also troubles a lot of those assumptions that people who are obsessed with white slavery and trafficking at that time did. She doesn't have a relationship with a pimp. She's not led to her downfall by a man, nor does she feel entrapped in the system. So we always had a certain amount of trust for her and a certain amount of trust for the newspaper as well. And it's been in the last year and a half actually that we really have been able to trace her story and see that as Devon mentioned, the vast majority of her narrative as she tells it follows her life in line until the very end, which did have to be changed for censorship reasons. Now, we are reckoning with this question of, so we know Alice Smith's real name now, but we frankly, as researchers, feel that this obsession with her name and who she is one of these other aspects of, for the same reason that these white slave narratives were so successful in the popular market, is the desire, this voyeuristic sort of lusting after sex workers and sex worker narratives that is always, married with judgment and shaming, and that's, we've been sort of reckoning with, well, in order for this narrative to be taken seriously by the greater historical community, we need to out this woman who obviously took great pains over the course of her life to protect her own identity. And, how can we possibly out this person whose story has meant so much to us, And so that's one of the sort of ethical questions that we are reckoning with at this point in time.
The paper went to incredible lengths to protect her identity. Fremont Older, the editor, his wife, in her diaries, she mentions that Alice Smith comes to visit her. She says Alice Smith in her personal diary, which means that she didn't know her name. So, Fremont Older's wife, who was a close confidant and she was a writer, she was an incredible woman, didn't know her name. So, if he didn't know her name, who are we to this became a really interesting question about anonymity that made us really approach it and think about it in a different way. And had we discovered her name early in the process, we might have published it. And so our research led us to this understanding, which has been an incredibly important kind of discovery for us. So.
Well, and just on that, it shows how remarkable the bulletin was, and how these sort of, number one, this newspaper was saying, we don't understand sex work. How can we pick a side on this debate, whether or not to support the red light abatement law, without actually asking sex workers themselves their opinion and how it's going to impact their lives? And number two, having the sensitivity to understand that protecting the identity of their sources was paramount. And these are the sort of baselines of respect within American media that, we're still struggling for today. I mean, I was just reading an article, and this is, I don't even want to talk about it because it's so it's fucked up, frankly, about this Border Patrol agent in Juarez who, murdering sex workers, and who was eventually found because a sex worker escaped and was able to identify him to the police, luckily. There were victims. There was a transgender victim who was being deadnamed in the media. Who the media has chosen to name her by her birth name as opposed to her chosen name. And so, the fact that in 1913 we had journalists who understood the baseline perspective of upholding somebody's sort of chosen identity or whatever in the media, and that journalists today don't take these questions seriously. So. My hair out. So
my experience, and I deal a lot with the media. I negotiate people's anonymity and people's privacy a lot in bringing their voices into the media. Those are things we deal with every single day. And to watch these media outlets, they've made so much money off of us, off the ad. Not only our stories, but our ads. The sex really does sell. And when you see the transition from print media to digital, and you see where we had ads in the print media, and they didn't carry over to the digital media. We ended up going off onto, Craigslist or the Arrow Guide, onto specific adult ad sites. And those media outlets didn't bring the classifieds with them. And they lost all that revenue. They lost all that revenue, and they lost their ability to pay journalists. They lost ability to pay investigative journalists. They lost a lot of credibility. And they now print from press releases. And the antis have a ton of public money, government money, taxpayer money that they have used under the guise of raising awareness to generate this false and misleading narrative all over again that has been reprinted in the media with no question about what it is that they're printing. So to always be in that situation of playing catch up and having to educate individual reporters or publishers, calling publishers out for holding them accountable. It seems like on one hand today, because of digitalization, you've got a bunch of, the Horn Nation on Twitter, Facebook, blogs, have done some good pushback, but, we're still in the same place. So, it brings into question, how are we going to capitalize on, the new world to make any real substantial changes where we can get people to stop making the same mistakes?
Mm-hmm.
The ending of, spoiler alert, the ending of Alice's memoir is that she gets out of sex work and she lives happily ever after, so-called, and this is where they had pressure, it ends quite abruptly, and it's always felt really unnatural to us, and we actually know that they changed it because they talked about, we had to change the ending about what really happened. We just recently came across that she was arrested a few weeks after the ending of the memoir. 2 weeks after the ending of the memoir, she was arrested, and she was a sex worker. And so what's interesting is that that's
prostitution.
Yeah, she was right. Yeah, so she didn't get as to after, she was still a sex worker as this was being published, and the fact that was the narrative that couldn't be allowed, it had to wrap up. She had to be saved in the end, and that was what kind of seemed like the paper's feet were held over the fire. You're gonna get your gun. This is how the narrative has to be done. This is how it was presented, and we actually lose track of her after that for several years, and then we pick up. She gets married, and she goes on with her life. She lived in San Francisco most of her life. She's She's buried here in the cemetery city of San Francisco. But what happened after that, we don't know. And it sounded like the memoir was going to continue, and it was going to talk about her life as a sex worker, continuing through that, and they didn't allow that to happen. And that's part of the anti-sex worker narrative that still, no one can talk about sex workers having agency, having their own abilities to make their own decisions. This victim mentality, or this person, that is the most obvious that haven't changed.
I wanted to just actually, if you don't mind, I pull out some quotes from some of these letters, because I will say some of the, one of the reasons why we trusted the bulletin was because of these letters that were being written in, and just how modern they sound, and how sort of diverse their messages were. There was no clear sort of political agenda that the editorial department of the bulletin sort of trying to build, because they were publishing letters from people who were pro decriminalization, as well as letters from women who said, we just need to castrate all men and this will solve the problem. It's like these recommendations that were being put out in the pages of the paper are many of them ridiculous, and many of them, quite smart, quite interesting. Well, let's see, I just wanted to, what the vast majority of these letter writers were saying was, greater societal circumstances made it so that this industry was the best choice I had to support myself financially, to support my family, and you good people of the above world, have all of your reasons for shaming us and slandering us without any actual understanding of either what it feels like to go to sleep hungry at night, or to be pushed into these whatever circumstances they may be. So and there were all these campaigns at that time. So these women's clubs who were organizing to criminalize sex workers also saw themselves as charity groups, and many of them, and there are very interesting books about how this creation of the anti-trafficking industry was actually a way for affluent white women who were reckoning with the transformations of gender expectations at that time, were trying to move out of just being bored housewives and to build careers for themselves, essentially. And that the creation of charities around rescuing their fallen sisters was a way to create employment opportunities for themselves in a world which, in which jobs weren't available to most women, and so it really was this sort of twist. There's just unfortunately this twisted self-serving aspect.
Nothing's changed. Nothing's changed.
Yeah.
That's what's happening. The wives of these senators and government officials who are that's their little pet projects, and the people who start these NGOs, nonprofits, they create salaries for themselves. We've known this for, the whole time, and this modern day incarnation of this. And that's what it is. It's profit for them. They are not only making money, trying to tear us down, but it's their, it's how they're, it's the same thing. It's crazy. Anyway, sorry.
Oh, no. So let's see. I was just going to read. So one of these letters by this woman who signed her name Ava Wilkins. She says, "Why do you speak of us as belonging to the underworld? Who then constitutes the upper world? Is it the men who come to visit us? And why are they in any respect above us? Is the woman who marries for money or for social station any better than we are? Does she not sell herself as we do? Is there any difference in selling oneself to one man for a year or for several years, or selling oneself to several men for a shorter or longer time? If there be, then I do not understand the meaning of the word morality." And she's one of these writers who essentially says, give us a district and leave us alone. And that was one of these solutions that's proposed by many of by many of these women who were writing into the paper was just get the police off our back, and that's one of the fascinating things about Alice's story is, there are no sort of there aren't any clear victims or perpetrators other than the police. The one really, the story that is the most sort of heart-wrenching throughout her entire tale is this one of a police officer these two police officers in Chicago who begin preying off of a streetwalker. And they're preying off a streetwalker who was pressured to work on the streets because her brothel was closed, And so that's one of these stories where you can see this real complex relationship between cleanup movements, forcing sex workers into street work, and then pushing them into the hands of the police, who, more often than anything, prey off of and abuse them. And like you said, if this is the obvious consequence that we see from reform movements time and time again, then what is the motivation here? Obviously the motivations are complex. You have women who are invested in anti-trafficking campaigns who believe that it's their life's work, or it offers them some sort of sense of being engaged in activism that they probably truly believe is meaningful, while being totally misguided. But then how much of it is just the workings of the carceral state, really?
Well, it's the capitalist state. It's the capitalist state that plays a big role in the journalism and deciding what gets printed and what doesn't. It's the capitalist state that, we're often, you saw that in the year 2000 in the Netherlands, where the window workers in the Netherlands had brought up the property values to a place where the mayor, was like, well, yeah, these property values have come up and we're going to close a bunch of the windows and we're going to appropriate that land to be art space and to be, something else. So, capitalism plays a big role here where it uses us, it uses women, in multiple different ways. And the carceral state, certainly, that's about profiting off the criminalization of women's bodies, obviously. But I'm wondering if the Me Too movement, or if, getting women elected into electoral politics has not proven to be a big solution here. Oops, did we lose them?
Warren, who we like to think of as being one of the more progressive in the current Senate, that she was one of the main supporters of FOSTA SETSTA,
Oh, Kamala Harris, you're talking. Sorry, you cut out there. So, Kamala Harris and Dianne Feinstein and, Nancy Pelosi. They were all big supporters of these bad policies. And, we have to get rid of those people. They're bad news.
Well, and that's what's so unfortunate, about sort of like raw, broad-based, like women's rights movements that have no, mainstream feminism that doesn't really engage in any nuanced discussion around racial politics and class politics here,
Well, yeah, look at the Kavanaugh hearings. We had Anita Hill testifying about being sexually harassed on her job. And all these years later, now we've got another nominee who's being accused of attempted rape of a teenager. So things have not really improved. The feminist approach, in my opinion, is a failed approach. It's not working on any level. Yeah. So we need to lift up the prostitutes and, bringing, the voice of Alice, to the public, today is very valuable. I want to really thank you for your work. I hope that you continue and, get to do more and we get to hear more from you, especially in the public sphere that, not only the Prostitute Nation, but the public at large needs to, hear that we've been through this before and we know how it ends. It's not going to end well for anybody. It certainly doesn't end well for the homeowners.
Yeah, well, we sort of like, we were incredibly blessed to have our book published by Heyday Books here in Berkeley in collaboration with the California Historical Society, and so we have this nice, this fancy seal of approval from a mainstream and highly regarded sort of historical society. Their stamp branded on the cover of our book, which we feel like it's sort of like the sleeper. It's like this unexpected attack through this book. That people are going to read it thinking that they're going to get the sort of same old like body tale of prostitution that they're used to reading about from sort of these like old Wild West narratives. But instead, what they're going to get is a really nuanced take on issues of class politics and gender and policing and capitalism that they won't expect, and that hopefully it'll sort of worm its way into people's minds and enhance some of the nuance around the dialogue with people who aren't expecting, or that's not what they're looking for, and that's one of the issues. Like you said, so much of the really forward-thinking writing about sex work that is happening is happening by and for sex workers themselves within these online communities and blogs, etc. There's this incredible richness of material and debate that's happening, but is it happening enough on the sort of mainstream scale? Absolutely not, and so how do we get there? Maybe we can capitalize upon some of this, voyeuristic desire that the normies have, call it Memoirs of Barbary Coast Prostitute, and, wrote those people in with that sort of salacious title and then force them to actually reckon with some deeper history.
Well, yeah, I think, that's why we do our YouTube channel here, is to try to bring forward, the voices of actual workers and to, platform the history. We've got a huge history. We've been here a long time. We're going to be here a long time. I remember when we had Lael Morgan. You just reminded me, Lael Morgan, who wrote the book The Good Time Girls about pioneering Alaska. We had her at the California Historical Society here in San Francisco back in the late 90s when she wrote that book. And, hosted her with a nice little luncheon and, with all the whores. And, that book talks about my hometown, Fairbanks, where the religious bodies came together and kicked out all the men and all the people who were identified as preying on the women, beating the women up, stealing from the women. And they gave the women their own district. They gave the women their own housing where they could work and live. And, that's how it went until the early 1960s. That started in the late 1900s. And then the early 1960s, when big oil came, the government was like, oh, wait a minute, don't you have laws against this? So, it's just, there are some models out there about how communities have dealt humanely with our population, and we just need to, be talking about it more and, talking about the patterns and what's worked and what's not worked, and getting more voices out there.
So are you guys going to be writing another book or putting out a new, updated version or something like that with the more recent information that you have been digging up?
Yeah, we're actually right now working on a long form magazine size article or journal size article that's partly going to be this updating of information that we've discovered since the publication, and partly to talk about our own experiences, our own personal experiences of doing the research and how, especially for me, I mean, I'm a white straight dude, and I've always, I come up in the punk scene and the anarchist scene, and I always considered myself to be, I've known sex workers throughout my whole life, and I've always considered myself to be an ally, but I found that I was extremely ignorant about so many issues, and so much experiential issues that I took advantage of just in sort of this sort of ignorant haze, and the process of this research. Alice has just profoundly changed my life, our lives, and so partially that's we're looking at trying to do that. And what's interesting is this book has legs. We just keep. One of the reasons we keep doing research about a book that's long been published is that the work isn't done, and that as we do more speaking tours, and as we talk, and as we do activism, there's so much of a desire. I mean, it's a living thing. It's not just it's not like we just publish it and we're going to move on to something else. We are working on another book that's involving the origins of the prison state in California. But, surprise, surprise, Alice shows up in all that research too, because these things are interconnected.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Well, that sounds awesome and very much appreciated. I mean, I'm still reading it, but I mean, I'm just amazed at this history. I'm very fascinated by the history of our community in the United States and elsewhere. But, Valentine's Day 1917, that's when they went in, all the cops to shut everything down. I mean, why did they pick Valentine's Day, but all sorts of history that, is otherwise lost. So I think it's really awesome that you guys have done this, and I hope that there'll be other books written by other people, Maxine, and other people who have this understanding of things that will otherwise be lost in history if we don't make a record of it. And I think it's very important. It's huge, and there's so much to learn from it, as you pointed out. So
absolutely. I mean, I hope that people begin their own research projects based on some of the information that we presented. So you're talking about Valentine's Day 1917. This connects really nicely back with how we sort of started this discussion about the Central Mission neighborhood meeting and this desire to eradicate prostitutes. So one of the points that I brought up in that meeting was, hey, we tried this once before in 1817. The cops evicted all of the sex workers out of the Barbary Coast neighborhood. There were 1,400 women who were dragged out of their homes and their workplaces. And what became of most of them? They ended up working on the streets in other neighborhoods around the city, and it scattered the problem as all of these, reformers from that era, that the language they wanted to use, and as I said, formed the stroll that we now see on Cap Street that these neighbors are so up in arms about. And so, obviously, this approach of eradication and eviction is completely ineffective. The only ways in which you could consider it effective is by increasing the numbers of criminalized, raped, and brutalized sex workers, and if you consider that a success, well then you're a sick person, But those are the sorts of histories that these people, when they engage in their cleanup campaigns, I mean, I like to think that they're just ignorant of this and not totally twisted. I hope that through promoting historical narratives, we can actually change people's hearts and minds. That might be an optimistic perspective, but it's one that I have to hold on to.
Something you pointed out, through the history that you wrote in the book, was that the reformers assumed, you give them credit by saying perhaps they were naive. We call that today unintended consequences. That they were naive in their assumption that they could eradicate prostitution by simply eradicating brothels, where today the assumption is that if you eradicate all of the online brothels like Backpage and our listing sites, that's just going to make it all go away. But no, again, it just hurts people, damages people, puts people in horrible situations, and it's never going to work. It's, and I do believe that in some instances it's unintended, but No. They've done too much research. People like Swanee Hunt, they know these are intended consequences on the part of some of these people. And they just don't care. If we are workers who are strong in where we want to be, unapologetic workers, we should be dead. That's, I think, how they see us, is that we need to die. We need to be blocked out. We are collateral damage they are more than happy to live with. So...
Well, actually, Alice is arrested, a couple weeks after Voice from the Underworld was so abruptly ended in the bulletin, and she was a madam in a brothel. And what some of these right wing papers that are essentially like the Tucker Carlson of Breitbart News of San Francisco at the time, they're horrifying to read. They outed her. They didn't know her name. She actually had a street name that they outed. Which is interesting. They obviously took it personally. They went after her. So the other papers that were anti-sex work or anti-sex worker rights didn't want to talk about Alice because they didn't want to listen. They didn't even want people to read it. But the fact that Alice was a madame of a brothel, they say that she herself procured. And that because it blew up the whole narrative, they said because she herself was
and thus could no longer be seen as sympathetic or deserving of any platform. And it's funny because we were our book is actually was targeted early on by FOSTA SESTA under the passage of FOSTA SESTA, which is, as I should have mentioned, neither of us are sex workers, neither of us have been sex workers over life, and so that's an issue that it's just a perspective that we like to be frank about. So it's known, that we attempt with all of the best as we can as allies not to claim any sort of ownership over these ideas as movement, of course. So Alice Smith, this story that we published, Alice Memoirs of a Barbary Coast Prostitute, we had these hashtags that we were using to promote the book on Instagram and Facebook. Incredibly innocent hashtags. One of them was hashtag Who is Alice Smith, which was a hashtag created by the publicity department, our publishing house. Hashtag, Alice Memoirs of a Barbary Coast Prostitute, etc. And the day after the FOSTA SESTA book was passed, those hashtags were censored and removed from Instagram and from Facebook, which was incredible to me because it showed sort of the broader consequences of this law and how it impacted those.
You weren't consequences, you were a target. You were part of the target.
Absolutely. And what's so terrifying about that is, ours is a book. It showed how the application of this law can be used to actually censor complicated narratives about sex work and the history of sex work.
Narrative.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that was a story that was shocking to, a lot of our colleagues and collaborators at the book project, who perhaps hadn't really thought critically about the passage of these laws before they saw that happen, and the sort of broad-based sweeping strokes that were being used under this new passage.
Interesting.
Are being used, yes.
Yes. Yeah. Well, thank you so very much.
Our lives and livelihoods weren't destroyed by it in the same way as others, but it was still an interesting application.
Yeah, it's wrong. It's absolutely wrong. Well, thank you so very much for everything you're doing, and it's awesome, and we appreciate you speaking with us today. Maxine?
We'll include, and we'll include all the links to the book, and to any other links that you want to send to us in the on the YouTube channel. And thank you for taking the time and contributing and being a part of the history on the new digital platforms. And we'll look forward to seeing you guys again in the future. Thank you so much.
Thank you both so much.
Thank you guys so much.
You.
It's been an honor.
Right on.
Definitely be in touch. This was great. A great time.
Thank you.
Dominate the nation.